This is Stassopoulos, and on this podcast, I will be speaking again with Gita Ghate. On the last podcast, we spoke about the power of looking at small samples, and today I want to talk with Gita more about how you would look at a market more holistically to make sure that you don't miss anything in your analysis. Gita, in the financial sector, when we look at emerging markets, we look at it from the financial lens. We look at GDP, we look at demographic statistics. Do you think that this lens is enough?
Yeah. So to me, the economic or the financial lens is important, but it's not enough. The socio-cultural lens is equally important. And the two need to come together in order for us to get a holistic picture of any market. So let me give you an example of India since I know the market so well. So there's a lot that's written about India being the consumption economy as an emerging market, the way it will grow, and there are lots of numbers now published around it. But I think what people don't talk about, or they talk less about, is the socio-cultural reason why this is happening. So of course we're becoming economically prosperous. But from a value and a beliefs lens, if you look at it, traditionally in India, denial was a virtue. So the less you consumed, even if you had the money to consume, the bigger the virtue it was. So you needed to deny or defer yourself, your wants and your aspirations. Today, desire has actually overtaken denial, and desire has become a virtue. And in some sense, greed has become good. So people are consuming much more. So you look at the numbers and you look at the socio-cultural reasons for those numbers, and it gives you a much clearer and sharper picture. It also helps you predict what will happen next. So one of the examples of desire is the way people are spending money on travel. The way people are eating more, they're eating out a lot more. It's not just affluence or affordability, but it's also about new tastes. It's about the desire for the new, for the different, that you can see consumption moving towards.
When you talk about denial, was that denial a conscious or a subconscious decision where people not being able to afford certain things, and they were saying, I really don't want an iPhone, but actually what they were saying is that I can't afford an iPhone?
So I think there are two things. I think it was a conscious thing, even for the ones who could afford it. Denial, like I said, was a virtue, and therefore you were, applauded for actually saying that, oh, he has the money, and he still denies himself this. So austere living or frugal living was actually something that was celebrated, because then you use that money wisely. So how well you spent your money, whether you had more or little, was actually, again, a way of social respect.
But for me, one of the biggest lessons I've learned in the decade I've been doing these ethnographic studies and we've been working together, when maybe 5-6 years ago, I first listened to consumers expressing denial, I viewed it through my value lens, not through their eyes. And I always thought they're just saying this because they can't afford it. But actually, what you realize that these consumers, a lot of them, have a very, very strong value filter lens.
So in India, to me, the other big thing that one needs to notice is value for money. And when I say value for money, it needs to have a certain worth. And the worth doesn't only need to be symbolic, it needs to be substantial. So one of the biggest examples that you can see today is what's happening to the iPhone in India. So iPhone is a status symbol, but a lot of consumers in India are beginning to realize, especially the younger millennials, that it may not necessarily be the value they seek. So there's a new brand called the OnePlus, which is now very popular, which is giving iPhone a run for its money. And you see many such value examples, which are actually determining how consumption will move in India. So there is desire, but in some sense, it is moderated with value.
When you look at India at the moment, where do you see it going from here?
So I think it's interesting because to me, there are two Indias. There is the metro India, which is where when markets got liberalized, and when we became an emerging market where people were putting their money, it was this metro India and the development of this 4-5 metro cities, Bombay, Delhi, Calcutta, Chennai, and Bangalore, which were actually where people were putting their money. But what you will see in the next 5 or 10 years is actually the rise of the tier 2, tier 3 cities, which are a population of 50,000, 100,000 plus. This is where you will actually see the new India emerge. So we call it India A and India B. It'll be very different from the India A of the metros. This will have its own growth trajectory. One, there are many more opportunities here, both entrepreneurial opportunities as well as job opportunities. These will grow. They will have their own aspirational trajectory. The government is also putting in much more money here, and smart cities are being developed. These are going to be the smart cities of the future. So you're going to see a very different India. So from a value lens, you will still see value for money here, but there'll be a different growth trajectory. And I think this is where the economists, the socio-culturalists, everyone needs to focus on this now, is the new face of India.
Actually, in the previous podcast, when we talked about the study that we did a year and a half ago together with you on the millennials and the Gen Z, and at the same time, a few months later, there was a quantitative study that was done by the World Economic Forum, and they interviewed 5,000 individuals compared to the 32 we studied their lives in depth. So there was just a questionnaire, and there were 5 insights, and one of the insights that came out was that the youth want more education. And when I looked at it, I didn't find that particularly insightful. You know that they will seek more education opportunities. For me, when we did our study, what surprised me about the youth was the feeling, particularly in the lower tier cities, that there was no longer the desire that we had a decade ago to migrate to a big city like Mumbai. They were feeling that the city now takes more away from you than it gives you, and there was a desire to move to a lower tier city like Pune, where they felt they were closer to their families and they had less drawbacks. How do you see that?
So I think it's interesting that you say this, because they actually believe, these millennials and the Gen Z in the tier 2, tier 3 cities, that they actually have it better than their metro counterparts, because in some sense they have the best of both worlds. These cities are getting modernized. They don't need to necessarily move away from their roots. They can stay anchored. They are surrounded by family and friends. There's a lot less loneliness, which is becoming a big issue in affiliative societies like India. So they don't need to go to a metro. They don't need to go away from their families. They don't need to necessarily move out of their comfort zone. They believe that these cities give them the opportunity, financial and also in social opportunities. At no point do they feel disadvantaged. So they want to stay where they are. The other interesting thing that we're beginning to see is a new identity dynamic that's coming up. So if you look at the metros, there's a lot of Western influence, and they are the westernized or more global Indians. What you will begin to see in some sense in the tier 2, tier 3 cities is what we're calling the birth of the modern national. This will be a very modern Indian. So in no way will he be different from his metro counterpart in terms of modernity, whether it's access to technology or it's access to fashion, but he will be much more national or more Indian in the way he looks at life. And so it's an interesting dynamic, and you also see it getting reflected in the political discourse very clearly. So in some sense, whether politics mimics life or life mimics politics, I don't know, but you begin to see it, and it gives you an indication of what the trend will be.
And from an investment consumption point of view, such a shift in patterns is quite dramatic, because it means that we need to reposition the way we are applying capital, the way we're thinking of servicing these people through brands in main cities. You need to start thinking about which brands resonate with this type of consumer in second-tier cities.
Yes, absolutely.
If you were to look forward to 2025, what do you think the 3 biggest trends that we will see in India by then?
So I think the first is what you said about the rise of the tier 2, tier 3 cities, and why this is where the focus needs to be. The second big opportunity is, and it's already beginning to come to India, is edu-tech or ed-tech, because very clearly in the tier 2, tier 3 cities, while you have a lot of educational institutions, access to education was very limited in India, and only the privileged have had it. Today, in some sense, technology is democratizing education. So you're beginning to see a lot of young people wanting technology to, educate themselves and their children. So you're going to begin to see this, and this is going to be the big game changer maybe in the next 10 years. If not, why 10 in the next 5 years? And the third thing to me is what we said about the birth of the modern national. This will become an interesting identity. So to me, really, if you were to look at it, the lens that one will need to look at, besides economic, is socio-cultural. Look at it, look at the tier 2, tier 3 cities, look at where they're going, and look at the early investable opportunities in these places. To me, this is really where your money will grow. This is the new money plant, so to say.
Yeah, for me, what is interesting when you think about the modern national is that the path of development is very different from how the developed world moved. You moved from a collective society, you move away from your village, you become very much an individual, and you continue focusing and growing as an individual, where you shift away from caring a lot about your status and how people are admiring you to just competing against yourself. But the modern national tends to have a more collective identity attached to it.
So the modern national is an interesting blend of both individualistic and inclusive, and they're able to do this actually very well. And so if you look at it, my favorite example is TikTok, and I give it all the time. It's inclusive and it's individual. It allows you to showcase yourself, but it also does it in a really inclusive way. So in India, in tier 2, tier 3 cities, they actually make videos of the family and of themselves, which is something you never see on YouTube, which is very clearly an India One or a Metro or global app. So there you're only focusing on yourself. So this whole the merging of the individual with a more inclusive society. And here, when I mean inclusive, it's very different from the way the West looks at inclusive. Because in the West, inclusive is, the whole LGBT community, and it's in India, inclusive really means the family. So it's about the family and the community, which is your uncles and your aunts and your joint family. So in some sense, it's that kind of individual and familial coming together which will define this modern national.
For me, what is also interesting is that if you look at the Indian message we used to have was about simple living, high thinking. And there is, when you look at this move, as you're moving towards a modern national, what you're seeing is a shift to desire that towards brands that have very simple messages of simplicity, honesty, integrity, authenticity, which is going almost back to the root of your...
Yes, I think they have, but in an Indian way. So I think it's about authentic Indianness rather than authenticity in the Western discourse.
Yes.
When you say you're going back to your roots, you're not going back to the earth in the way that it's not the naturals movement of the West. And I think that's why the socio-cultural lens becomes important, because you have to look at it from the market perspective. Like you said, in the earlier example, you come at it from your own lens, but you have to look at it from their lens, because when they talk about going back to the roots, it's about going back to things that are Indian. And like I said, this doesn't mean that they will not embrace what is modern, but there's definitely a need in some sense to repackage the Indian. So in the old days, an Indian brand was not good enough, because in my identity as a global citizen, I would rather align myself to a global brand than an Indian brand. But you're very quickly Indianizing a lot of brands. So you're beginning to see the birth of the modern national. You will see a lot of modernity, but you will also see a lot of, I don't want to use the word nationalism, but definitely more Indianness.
Gita, we've been working together for a decade doing ethnographic studies in India. And I remember when I first met you in 2009, you said to me at the time that I have to make sure that I'm in India at least every 3 years to make sure I'm on top of changes. But over the last 3 years, I've been coming not only once a year, sometimes I've been coming twice a year. And there seems to be a lot of dynamic changes that are taking place in the last few years in India. What's causing that, and how do you think we should approach it?
So I think there are two things that are causing it. One, like the rest of the world, we're getting exposed to technology and it changes every day. So therefore, India in that sense is looking at technology the way the rest of the world is in which. But I think more importantly, the consumers of this technology in India are a much younger audience, and in some sense like the young anywhere in the world, and we are a much larger number than the young anywhere else in the world. They absorb and they act out that technology much faster. So the changes that we are beginning to see in India are much more dynamic, they're a lot faster, and they're being done the Indian way. Just like the rest of the world, they moved from desktops to laptops to smartphones and as screens. In India, we moved straight from desktops to smartphones, and we missed the laptop revolution completely. So India is moving so quickly and in its own way that if you don't get there fast enough, you will miss actually a very important act of the party. And I think it's very important for you, therefore, to be there every 6 months to see what's going on.
Thank you for taking the time, Gita.
Thank you, Tassos, for having me.